Hello and welcome to Virtualize Everything. Today we're going to be taking a look at how I configure and set up Unbound and Pi-hole here in 2025. Since October of 2020, I've set up Pi-hole the same way. I've used an LXC container inside of Proxmox or a Proxmox container running the latest LTS version of Ubuntu, and I've installed all the applications directly into that. And it's worked really well for me. I've been very satisfied with the speed, reliability, and quality of service doing that. But I've recently decided that I want to change more of my applications that are running here on Proxmox into containers and then run them using Docker. And I want to do that for a various amount of management reasons and also just to use Docker and learn more about Docker. And my Pi-hole is no different. So today we're going to be looking at the newest way that I'm setting up Pi-hole and Unbound. So with that, let's get to the presentation and look at the steps I'm taking to set these containers up. The first thing I'm going to do is clone a installation of Ubuntu 22.04, which is the latest Ubuntu version, and it also has Docker installed on it. If you need help installing Docker and getting this container set up, go ahead and check the video out that I have linked in the descriptions or above. And the next step I'm doing is I'm cloning this. Now, if you're making this for the first time, you won't have to do these steps, and I'll give it a name if you are. With the name filled out, I can go ahead and hit clone, and Proxmox is going to go ahead and automatically make my container. Now, as Proxmox is making this container, we want to go ahead and go over to networking, and we want to select our networking tab and hit edit, and then we're going to hit static. Now, my CIDR notation is going to be 24, and that's the pretty standard CIDR notation for most networks. If you don't know, there are other ones, but we will be using 24. You want to make sure you always put that on the end of your IPv4 addresses here inside of the Proxmox window, or things aren't going to work right. So we're on VMBR 3, which should give me an IP range of 192, 168, and I believe it's 3. And let's just pick 105 here. That should be outside of the range of anything that's running. And again, my CIDR notation is 24. We're going to also enter 192, 168. 1 for my gateway. Now, these may differ on your network. So if you're following along, make sure you're using the right IP addresses for your network, or your project's not going to work correctly. So let's go ahead and hit OK. And now my static IP address is set for this particular container. So we can go ahead and start it up, and we can open our console window. Once it starts up, we can log in. The default's going to be root and whatever password you set up when you created the container. I've also set up an admin user account or sudo user account for this container, so I will be using VE and my container password. All right, now that we've logged in to our Ubuntu container that has Docker pre-installed, this setup should be the same as any other system that has Docker installed. The commands are going to be more Debian type commands because we are working on Ubuntu. But the first step we're going to need to do is update and install any updates that are available for our system. And to do that, we're going to use the command sudo apt update, and we'll string it together with 2 ampersands and then run a sudo apt upgrade, and we'll answer why, so this whole process will run automatically. I'll be back with you when the updates are finished. Now that our container is done updating and installing all of its updates, we're ready to jump right into this program. And the first thing we're going to do to jump right into this program is start out by starting a Docker Compose YAML file. Now, we don't need to create a subdirectory, but this would be a good point to create a subdirectory and move yourself into it if that's how you organize your projects and you're running multiple Docker projects on the same container. I don't do that. I run one Docker project per container. It's the way I like to organize it. I see no problems with doing it. Others may want to do this differently. So I'm going to start by creating my Docker Compose file by running the command sudo nano docker compose. Here inside of the nano editing window, I'm going to copy and paste the configuration that I have here. This configuration can be found in the links in the comment section or the description section below, and it will link to my personal website for those details. Let's take a look at this file here. We have a defined network bridge that we're calling DNS network, and we're setting a static IP address range. This is because inside of these two separate containers here that we're creating with Docker Compose to be part of this full container stack, we are specifying static IP addresses so we can more easily communicate inside of the stack among the two services that we're running here, Unbound and Pi-hole. So Pi-hole's a pretty standard setup. We are using an EVI file, as you can see here, for both the web interface password and the time zone password. Although we are using the Pi-hole DNS tag, we're setting that as static, and that's going to point to our Unbound container, which is working on port 5053 or outgoing on port 5053. Internal, it's port 50, and has a static IP address of its own. You can also notice for information storage, we have set 2 volumes. So Pi-hole has its own information stored separate outside of the container, so that container information is kept stored for later on. Just makes it easier if this container ever restarts or anything, you don't lose all your logs and other information. We're doing the same for Unbound, but with Unbound, we're passing in a configuration file that's on the host system right here, and then we pass in some dev files that are on the system so that Unbound knows what's going on from the host system. All right, so now that we've taken a look at this, we can press Control X to save it and Y and enter, and we can go on with creating the rest of the files we need to create. So we will need to make a subfolder here for Unbound, and that's where we're going to store our configuration file. We will use mkdir unbound to do so, and then we'll use sudo nano to create the unbound conf f file with this command right here. Inside of this command, we are entering a lot of configuration settings, and I've gone ahead and edited this file to make it easier for it to be copied and pasted. If you would like to see the full commented configuration file, which is pretty large, you can go ahead and check the links in this write-up that you find on my website. I've provided a link. This guy, Jim's Garage, did do a video on this setup 11 months ago. I did find some problems with his video as far as not knowing where to put things or what commands, and that is why I'm doing my own separate video. I also want to show you the way that I'm doing things. Some things that you might want to take note, though, is how many threads Unbound is using. This may affect how many cores or CPUs, which directly correlate to threads inside of Proxmox, you want to assign this container. So now that we've talked a little bit about how this is working and this configuration file and where to find the commented configuration file if you want to edit this at all, let's go ahead, save this, and move on with the installation. The next part of the installation is to create your env file or your environment variable file, and the next step is going to be to create your environment variable file that we are pointing to for your Pi-hole setup. And we're going to use the command sudo nano, and you can see on our screen, we're already at the window to do so, and we are copying in the information for our web interface password as well as our time zone. I've gone ahead and provided in the write-ups a link to all the different time zones you can choose if you're not in the New York, America time zone. Also, the web password I'm leaving as password here for this video, but you do want to make sure you're changing that for your particular setup. Hitting Control X, Y, and Enter will save this file and move us on to the next step, which is going to be to turn off our system DNS resolver. And if we don't do so, port 53 is going to be blocked by this DNS resolver, not allowing us to actually activate Pi-hole and use it as a server. And we need to permanently disable this resolver, so we're going to use this command to disable that resolver permanently. This will edit Ubuntu's configuration files so that this resolver doesn't turn on if our system ever reboots. And now lastly, it's time to start up our Docker Compose file with the command docker compose up. And if you use -d, it will hide all your logs. So if you're ever having a problem with your Docker stack booting up and things aren't running when you run Docker PS, you can drop that -d and look at a log that tells you about what's going on. Now Docker is going to run. It's going to pull down both our Unbound and Pi-hole images from Docker Hub and attempt to start them. I'll be back with you to show you the next steps once this is finished. Okay, so now that everything has been set up and started and says it's running, we're going to run the command docker ps to make sure it's all up and running. And if we get two separate containers, one called Unbound and one called Pi-hole, everything should be running. But what we want to do is run a dig command at localhost for example.com. And if we get a return, we know everything is working. So let's go ahead and do that right now. And since we got a return right here, everything should be up and working and Unbound should be running. So we can go ahead and check out our Pi-hole web interface, and we'll do that by opening a new tab and going to 192.168.0.105/admin. And you'll remember this IP address from what we configured earlier in the video. I did originally configure it as 3, and I realized that I was on the wrong bridge, so it is 0 for this bridge. And we set up this password to be password, so we'll enter password and press enter, and you can log in. And you can see that we already have some DNS queries going on here. We have 5. That's from our particular dig command that we issued, and you can see that our container communicated out here as well as localhost. If we click on localhost, you can see that there were some ARP requests here in the logs, and our container should be for example.com, just as we saw below. So I hope you enjoyed this video and you're able to get Pi-hole and Unbound up and running inside of Docker. I think this is going to be a very convenient and easily migratable setup for the next years to come inside of my network, and I hope you enjoy it too. As always, have a good night. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.